Welcome to our second video on health psychology, where you're going to be learning about coping strategies. The Serenity Prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. In our lives, we're going to experience many different types of stressors. And what I would like to share with you today are a couple of strategies that we can use to learn to recognize the type of stressor that we have in our lives and the best way to deal with that stressor. So I want you to look at this list of examples, and I'd like you to categorize the examples as largely controllable or uncontrollable. So take a moment to pause this video and see if you can identify which is the best category to place each stressor in. Hopefully you paused the video and you decided that maybe the English project due date, overspending, and driving under the speed limit are largely uncontrollable. And the weather, your parents' divorce, a genetic disorder, they're largely uncontrollable. And you may see that the weather, like a hurricane, for example, while largely uncontrollable, can also have some controllable components to it. So I understand, of course, that stressors aren't necessarily black and white. But we can probably agree that we can describe stressors as largely controllable or largely uncontrollable. And then once we realize that, we can deal with the stressor. So there are two main types of coping strategies that we can use. We can either solve the problem or practice self-care. So trying to approach the problem in a more strategic way, like problem solving, is called problem-focused coping. This involves identifying the problem, considering multiple solutions, weighing the cost and benefits, and selecting alternatives. When it comes to something that you really cannot change, then you need to accept and take care of yourself. More importantly, seek social support so that you can feel that connection to another person and develop a sense of acceptance. So again, go back to the list of examples that I gave you. But this time, classify the coping strategy, not the stressor, but the coping strategy. Would you say that it's best to deal with the stressor using a problem-focused coping strategy or an emotion-focused one? Go ahead and pause the video and then select which approach you think is best for each of these stressors. Hopefully you paused the video and you found the same things. The problem-focused coping actually matches controllable stressors, and emotion-focused coping matches uncontrollable stressors. So this sounds logical, but in reality, sometimes we try to control things that we cannot control, or in relationships, we keep fighting fights that should not be fought because they're just not solvable problems. Maybe you just need to accept that person the way that they are. But then there are some things that maybe we're better off trying to control and trying to address. So perceived control is the overall sense of agency, that you know when to apply your effort to control stressors. And if you're smart about how you manage stress, then over time you can develop a very high level of perceived control. And we know that this is important because perceived control is highly correlated with a lot of great outcomes, including better mental health, higher income and greater happiness, better overall well-being, and less stress. And as a matter of fact, poverty and perceived control are correlated. Now remember, correlations do not mean causation. In other words, one thing is not necessarily causing the other. This is correlational. We know that people who live in poverty are less likely to think that what they do matters or that it's going to affect change. The higher you go up in socioeconomic status, in other words, a person's level of income, education, and social prestige, like your profession, the higher you go on that scale, the more people report having a sense of perceived control. And this matters a lot. This could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So think about living in poverty and how a person may feel frustrated with having tried to get out of poverty and how this may lead them to become less likely to try again to improve the conditions that they're living in. Think, for example, about a homeless person who doesn't have an address and therefore finds it very difficult to find a job since employers generally require an address for employment. And how after trying to seek a job a few times, this person is denied employment and then feels like they should stop trying. I think this image nicely demonstrates the difficulty that some may have in really understanding the burden of poverty and how this can lead to a person's lowered sense of self-control, which then can affect all of those positive outcomes that we looked at. So let's go back to the Serenity Prayer. Let's include some of what you've learned today. Grant me the serenity to use emotion-focused coping for what I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can through problem-focused coping, and the wisdom to know the difference so I can improve my health, well-being, and socioeconomic status.